Just so you know, I have, now let's see, is that working? Yeah, okay, so I have videos in the presentation. If it doesn't work, just let me know, and I have a sort of backup. So as you said, I'm going to talk about material speculations and what I really, which is an approach that I take in the research we do. And really what I want to talk about is this idea of, through design, creating spaces for inquiry. So this idea of designing to know. And I'll leave to the whole why. I mean, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to the workshop. I'm sorry I missed it earlier. I have a feeling that the speakers are well curated, so I'll leave the editorial part of why I'm here or how I fit to the panel and discussion later, and I think it'll be really fantastic. Just to give you some background, I'm at Fraser University. This is the Everyday Design Studio, which is the research studio where myself, my PhD students and graduate students, and Will Odom, some of you may know, joined our studio a couple of years ago. So that was really great. We do a lot of our work here. And as was mentioned, I spend a third of my time at TUE in Eindhoven with Future Every Day. And it's actually really great now. I've been there since 2014. And I would have to say that at this point, I would say almost all of our research happens literally through DHL, a lot of shipping things back and forth. And unfortunately, not as many people are traveling back and forth these days. So it's really been kind of transatlantic, which is really quite nice and what I'd hoped for. So my research is kind of stretches back. I guess I've been at this for a while, but I wanted to give you some context. So earlier on, really doing work in tangible computing, augmented reality. Spent a lot of time sort of, middle point, I applied for one grant. It was on ethnography and technology. Ended up taking a large chunk of my research, which is really quite fascinating, doing work on what I called everyday design. But really what I'm going to focus on is the work of the last 5 or 6 years, which I call material speculations, and I'll speak to what that is. And just to give you a background, a backdrop of where I'm coming from. So I'm not going to talk about this per se, but really have been working much on this idea of a sort of a post-human investigation of design. This is now a plug. So this is an advertisement. I have a book that's coming out in fall 2021 that speaks to some of this. You'll see strands of this in my discussion, but I'm not going to speak directly to this idea of post-humanism necessarily, although I will talk about things about non-human-centered and non-humanistic approaches to design and technology. So I missed earlier on the discussions. I'm sure they were really great. A lot of great discussions now going on about design research. And I wanted to just give you my position, where I come from when I say I do design research. One of the most, I think for me, turning points was a paper by Daniel Fallman in 2003. It's really actually quite a simple concept, but this just shows you where we were in HCI at the time. This idea that rather than doing design that was in the service of HCI research, this idea that you design-oriented research, that through design, you would create new knowledge in and of itself. But Daniel did a really nice job of framing that, and I highly suggest you read that and other work by Daniel. He's really quite articulated, and this is some nice work in post-phenomenology, et cetera, and design. I'm also really influenced by Italian radical design. Late 60s, early 70s is a work by Mario Bellini. It's called Kara Sutra. It's actually the first concept car. So for all the car fanatics out there, this was actually the first concept car, which I think we now consider an anti-concept car, which was the idea of a full-scale real car, but doesn't work. But this was a critique. This was a critique about consumer capitalism, about mobility, et cetera, and through the act of making something. And of course, the work of Dunn and Raby, things like Placebo Project, Design Noir, Speculative Design. And again, the idea of you create this investigation through the making of something, and things would reconfigure around that. And a really good friend of mine, but also just really the most inspiring work for me, it's something I always come back to, Bill Gaver's work. I'm sure many of you people know this. This is a work in 2004. It's called Drift Table. As you can see, there's a hole in the middle of the table. And if you look in that hole, you get an aerial view of London. Now, if you put objects, as you can see in the other picture, if you put objects in different parts of the table, the aerial view literally drifts in that direction. So, but what I thought is fascinating about this is it changes all the relationships we have to all the objects, all the things. A table is no longer a table, a calculator is no longer a calculator, a ceramic doll is no longer a ceramic doll. These things are all open to investigation. He was, of course, exploring what he meant by ludic engagements, so rather than functionality or other things, you want to look at the ludic capacity of things, but this opens up a lot of territory. So in my own recent work, this is what I'm gonna, so this is a sort of material speculation. This is quite a series of works that we've been doing. And we have a large ongoing projects. You can see we very much do focus on it. We actually call a lot of these things, well, they're counterfactual artifacts, and I'll explain what that is. But you can see we really do work through the way in which we design these objects, almost the way in which you would craft a research paper or craft a research question that is very much embodying the idea of what we're trying to do as a matter of research. Now, I'm just going to focus on two of these projects and a really quick dives. And I thought it was the best thing to do was just give you some examples of how I do things, leave a lot of gaps, and then hopefully we can have time for discussion or in the panel afterward. Before I do that, I wanted to just kind of give you an overview of what I mean by material speculations. And so this was a paper that we wrote for amazing conference. I don't know if anybody knows this conference. It's the decennial Aarhus conference. So this conference only happens every 10 years. And it's quite amazing when you look at it. I think it's something when you review the papers, you see the papers, not that they're said to be 10 years future looking, but they kind of have to have a shelf life to them. So I think it really pushes the, to write their papers. I'm really quite honored and happy our paper was in. But the idea behind material speculations is to situate actual design artifacts in the everyday. So mine's a kind of, if you like, an empirical speculation. And this is, by doing this, this is the site of inquiry. So this is what, it's kind of a distilled notion of what I mean by material speculation. It derives from what's known as possible worlds theory. So this kind of has a dual life, one in analytical philosophy, another in literary theory. So in literary theory, for example, if you think about a fictional character, you think about Sherlock Holmes, you know, all the reality, the author doesn't need to construct gravity for Sherlock Holmes to walk down the street. It occupies the world that is ours, but it's a fictional world. It's a what if, it's a possible world. In analytical philosophy, we might ask the question, and I think we all want to ask the question, what if Donald Trump wasn't elected? You know, what would that world be? And I think we would really engage that quite seriously and quite analytically. Now, this is done through, in philosophical terms, counterfactual propositions or counterfactual statements, things we know not to be true, but things we're going to willingly engage. I approach this as making counterfactual artifacts. So rather than a statement, so this could be anything, design anything. And the idea, again, being that it's designed in a way that you wouldn't normally design it, but it exists in our world. And once it exists in our world, then we can ask the questions, well, what are the conditions that allow it to exist? Or what are the conditions that might challenge its existence? And those are the things I'm really interested in. A good example of counterfactual statement, I don't know how many people know the author Haruki Murakami, Japanese author, really a magical realist. This is a great book. I think, I mean, there's any number of books you could pick up his. This is, it's a fairly lengthy one, but it's actually good for my point. This is IQ 84. The story goes, it's typical Murakami, everything's going quite boringly, actually, in quite mundane ways, but things are going slightly stranger. And here, midway through the book, the protagonist is in a playground at midnight, just wanders there, couldn't sleep, and looks up and notices there are two moons. And wonders, when did that happen? Like nothing, why am I in a, is a possibility that there's an alternative to the reality that he occupied before? Or what is happening and how does that then challenge all the other assumptions that he's made about the world he's in? So I like to think that I'm kind of designing sometimes a second moon. But the strategy here is one of defamiliarizing. So this goes back to Russian avant-garde, this notion that through some strangeness, you can question assumptions. This was talked about, Rosie Berdadi talks about this in posthumanism. Genevieve Bell has talked about this in HCI, but this idea to take something familiar and through something slightly strange, you then question all the assumptions about familiarity. Okay, so let me dive in on one of the projects. This is called Table Non-Table. This is a table. It's not really a table, but as the title suggests, some references. I'll try to give a link to this presentation so you can catch up on these. What is it? It's a stack of about 1,000 sheets of paper. It's on a fairly robust aluminum chassis. You actually plug this table in. Every once in a while, it will move for a short duration. And we are really trying to understand kind of domestic technology designing a lot for the home and this idea of what are these interactions in a non-human centered fashion? What would that even mean? And a lot of our work, since we're trying to kind of get at subtleties and nuances that are not typically explored, we often do a video to kind of help envision where we're going with this. So I'm going to see, is that working? Just give me a thumbs up. Yeah, okay, great. So this is a day in the life of the table non-table. All right. So this was just backup. So, but anyway, the idea in this video, this was in case the movie didn't work. So there's a real kind of displacement. So displacement of, I mean, I think we tend to design human-computer interaction, human-robot interaction is really that we design for humans, and humans are at the center of this. And this is a displacement of things, and not only displacement of the human inhabitant, but also the very thing we're designing. It has a sort of marginal place in the video. So this was this idea, we're trying to get at all these other relations. And so to do this, as I said, we do this empirically, and we engage in field studies. So I have a background in ethnography, so this is something we do as well. We actually did quite like a 4-year period of different ethnographic studies with this. Part of this was figuring out the technique. Part of this was the time period that this was taking. We're also very interested in temporality and duration, not just how you interact, but how you live with the things that we make and how that changes over periods of time. So here you can see different people play with it. We've gone from not giving any instructions to telling exactly what we're trying to do. We've done the range, but they can do with this as they please, so to speak, and that's really in part what we invite. And it finds different locales and situations in the home. And maybe this relates to Deborah's presentation earlier. One of the it never fails with the non-humans in the homes. Whether they be cats or rats, they always love the table non-table. So a fair amount of non-human interaction there, which is not really what we're after, but this is all very welcomed. And so what we pull out of this, and I'm going to just sort of do highlights, but there's a writing on this that we've done, and we call this unself-conscious interaction. So this idea that we're really as interested in the intersection as opposed to interaction. So if you think about leaving a wine glass on the table non-table is what we would call intersection. But this happens over time and unknowing and it's cumulative. And these kind of generate what we call ensembles. So not just the way in which table non-table interacts with or intersects with humans, but how it intersects with other things. So what are the things that gather around it? How does all of this form and shape not just your environment or your setting, but actually your daily life and shapes you? So that's the kind of thing we're trying to articulate and trying to describe. And of course, this is all premised on the fact that people will, even though they're not really sure why, will want this or some degree will keep this. It'll have a place in their home. So it'll have a fit, as we call it. And in thinking through about designing of technologies, and we've written another paper about unaware objects, but this idea that this is not designed for, it's not designed, it doesn't direct itself at people or at humans. It's actually quite unaware. In a technology sense, that seems odd, but quite when you think about this, in almost every other sets of objects and things designed, they are unaware of the people around them. And we seem to now privilege this awareness of others, particularly humans. And this leads to a concept really of mediation and mediating of technologies, in that sense that the these assemblages that form, they actually determine norms. They create conventions. They shape you and you shape them. This is all to be adapted in part. Has some resemblance to what Deborah was talking about with ecologies, but it's just more in a relationship to technology. Okay, so the other project I want to talk about was Tilting Ball. And so this is it. Here's the main reference, I guess, to the paper we wrote for Kai in 2018. It is, well, it's a ball that tilts. And it's and the question we had, so we designed a number of these and we embedded technology in them, and every once in a while, periodically, infrequently, it would tilt. And the question, we're extending this notion of mediation, but trying to understand the ways in which technologies and things, anything that we design really, creates conventions, creates norms, and helps to establish and support, but also can disrupt norms. So this is another video, and this is just to give you a sense of what that would be. Again, that's trying to envision what this is like. So in this particular video, this is two roommates who are moving in together. And for anyone who's ever, I'm sure you all have had at different moments, had to move to a new apartment with a new roommate. And there are two things that are really striking about that. One is you don't know the other person. So suddenly now the familiar, your everyday, your home is strange and now has this other person in it. But also all of your things. Everything is new in some sense, even if it was you brought it in, everything has to be rearranged and there's a period. And this is actually the missing masses, as Bruno Latour would call it, of the things that shape our life and shape our everyday. So let me get to the video. So this is two Vincents. It's actually the same actor. He's not really an actor, he's a student. But anyway, playing this role of two roommates living together.
All right, that's it. He just comes in here, Mr. Johnny New Eggs, with his moving the mail and his see you, pal.
So again, with the tilting ball set, I think you get the idea of what the kind of relationships that we're seeking, and then we engage in a series of field studies with this. I'm going to speak mostly to the first one. We just wrapped up the last one, which was it was over 2 years of living with the tilting ball. In this particular case, we actually a method we use we call co-speculation, where we asked in total between the two studies 10 philosophers to live with the tilting ball. And the idea was we had a very specific question about technological mediation. We had a very specific question about construction of norms through mediation and conventions. And so we really wanted people that could engage with us. And now we weren't interested in their experience necessarily or interested in how they use the tilting ball, but how they could, through living with it, co-speculate with us, engage the questions that we had. So here it is, of course, living. I mean, it's doing what a ball does. It holds things, and every once in a while it tilts. And there are a whole number of insights. I kind of went to that I think are the most interesting. I think they give us some, I would call material thickness to, I mean, sometimes they're concepts, they could be philosophical concepts, but what's the richness? What's the materiality that we attach to these concepts, or what can we understand? How can we make it thicker? So in particular, we came out of these studies, and the first one was this idea of otherness of things. And so I'm going to focus on that, but also the kind of way that the multi-stability, the relativistic views of things, that things are not fixed. They're always in that kind of shifting of relations and shifting of meanings. But also this works out materially, so shifting of practices. So the idea of otherness and alterity, and I think many of you know, particularly those from Twente, Peter Paul Verbeek, and post-phenomenology, the ideas of alterity relations. So this idea that you interact, and this is something very common in human-computer interaction, clearly in HRI, that we interact with technologies as an other, as some sense of we can engage in dialogues, for example. But if we extend this notion of other, and this came out in our discussion, so for example, one of the participants related the tilting bowl to their phone, that it would do things, in a sense, had some sense of autonomy, so to speak, and autonomous behavior somewhat, very, but it was constant, it was like this phone, but then really shifted that understanding of otherness to being like the house plant, or being like their fish in their aquarium, a matter of care, a matter of companionship. To extend this, even this otherness, so this is two of our participants, and they had what you can see here is a piece of paper and a tin cup in the tilting bowl. This was the classic question: if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there, does anyone hear it, or does it fall? This is when the bowl tilts and they weren't in the room, did it tilt? And so they wanted to know. So if it tilted, the piece of paper would fall over, or hear the tin cup. So this was their tilting trap. They were really quite proud of it. We came back several months later, and this came up again, and really interesting how they now perceived it. And they argued, wait a minute, this trap that we set up, and they saw this otherness. They extended it metaphorically to like refugees. This was a period of course, of the migration period, and this idea of not believing or trusting and wanting to surveil, and they really felt complicit, or they felt uneasy or ambivalent about this. But also what came up in another context with other sets of philosophers, and it was again about the over time, the normalization of this tilting bowl. Why can't all bowls tilt? Or boy, I really like this one. This is something that I cherish. And a question by one of the philosophers saying, wait a minute, what are we going to accept here as norms? And at what point do we say that we just, these norms shouldn't just creep up? Well, how do we engage, mediate, deal with critically, understand that? And so he saw this as an ethical concern of what we consider norm with a fruit bowl that tilts. So really, I just wanted to kind of sum up, because I want to leave some time for questions. And this idea of designing to know. So that's really what I'm after. So creating these sites of inquiries, creating things, engaging them, and engaging the material thickness of what those experiences are, and doing that through design in different modalities, which is a different modality than how we do it through language to understand things. So the things I want to leave you with is the idea of defamiliarization and the relationships that technologies have to mediation and norm conventions. This notion of thinking through the thing-centered perspectives of things, that this is in a sense the missing masses, what we don't actually tune into enough. And then ultimately that our relations to technologies, which we think are quite fixed, but actually we fix them. And this has come up in some of the other conversations, but really there's still to this day quite a complexity and messiness, and then we can engage that messiness through the things that we design. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was really great. And yeah, I invite questions from the audience. Please feel free to type or ask. If not, I would like to kick off the discussion then. I have a question.
I also have a question later,
Yeah, so I think like now it's not as much as it used to be, but when the research through design first started, there has to be some sort of a struggle to show that this is a legitimate way of producing knowledge. And especially compared to the more established scientific fields, like this was a very experimental and very open, flexible approach of research through design needed a lot of convincing that this is really like a legitimate. So I was curious, how did you overcome this? And would you, because now we see that like to introduce this kind of an approach to the HRI also will lead to similar struggles. So what would be the advice? So how we can convince this established field that this is also very nice approaches and it will produce different types of outcomes?
So that's a great question, and I know I can speak to in HCI and I mean, and still to this day, research to design. I mean, it's still problematic. I mean, and I think in a more less experimental, if you like, or more traditional way of doing research to design than I do. But I think there's some really good discussions around that. They actually raise some really good questions, and so I mean, certainly, like for example, you know, there's what Jody Forlisi and John Zimmerman wrote on research to design, but then the counter arguments that came from Bill Gaber and others, and the relationship between what we want to know. And I think that becomes the question. And I think that it's, research design is right there in the middle of it. So from a, as you say, from a science perspective, this is not something you can validate. And so the question, the epistemological value of it, from a design perspective, if you're over to the other end, is that you question it as actually being a scientism of design. And so therefore it doesn't know in the way that design knows. Now, you're asking me a really practical question. I guess I stopped listening to the arguments, and I guess I did what I thought was valuable and took the risk. I understand the work, though, that needs to be done in a particular field. I can tell what happened in HCI. There was I remember early on, actually, I put out that paper in 2003, and it was a conference. And actually, it was strange. So actually, there was a workshop in 2003, and it was about doing design and HCI. A lot of people attended the workshop. But strangely, the group was divided into two. All the designers were put into one group, and they were told to say, how can we make design appreciated and understood and given and made credible to those scientists? And then the scientists were put in another side, another group, and they say, how can we find some value in design? So it was really, you know, I mean, problematic to begin with. But one of the arguments that came out was that you have to get, it was someone who was actually, he snuck into our group. I was, of course, in the design group, quite a well-known HCI kind of researcher. And he said, if you want to change things, do what you were doing now. Get into workshops, you know, get onto review committees. And that's the practical side of it. Do the community work. I mean, I think find what's valuable. I don't think there's the professionalism of what we do. Not going to take away from that. We need that puts food on our table, et cetera. But what do we really want to do? And you can't do it alone. But the mechanics, academic communities are really, I mean, I also was an editor of Interactions magazine for a number of years. And so took on a role in the community. I was scared shitless about it because I did not see myself as an HCI person. But anyway, that's my answer.
Thank you very much. And Luther, you had a question?
Yeah, my question, I think it was really related. In fact, to go in this direction, I wanted to ask more like, how was the field study designed to give us some hint on, okay, how do we move now? We have something that is critical, that is showing us something that is, not really functional, just it's a way to explore our understanding of things and relationship with things, but then how do we move in this space once we have these things?
Yeah, so I think I started off in a fairly traditional intersection of ethnography and HCI and doing these kind of field studies. But and I think that over time, I mean, we've gone through that wave, you know, and that was fairly accepted. But there's a way in which you do that with I think, so there's a certain amount of, I guess, accepted way of writing and putting together a coherent study. I think there's value. I mean, again, it always comes down to my mind to what the value is. I mean, I think there needs to be a thickness to the description. There needs to be uniqueness to the description. And I think that ultimately is what wins the day. But there was a lot of interesting methodological work for us. And so, for example, there's one of the papers on the table, non-table, which was accounted for that 4 years of ethnographic studies and the different ways. There's a paper written, led by a PhD on Sabrina Hauser. It's actually quoted in there. I think it's 5 years of deployment of the table, non-table. And it was us wrestling with actually three things. This idea of designing an artifact to ask these kinds of questions. So the research to design question, the notion of theory, and then the methodological, to how we combine the empirical and methodological work to bring all of this together. And it was kind of an honest account of our struggles with that. And so I don't think that there is a, I think actually, and the more I think about it, I think that's a real place of contribution. There's some transference of the work we've done. People have come to us methodologically to ask, hey, I've got this really, really challenging question. And, you know, how can I do this? What are some methodological approaches? I think that, so methodologically, that's a great way to fill in some of the gap. Some people want to do it, they just don't know how, I think, which is kind of your question.
Yes, and I think our audience in this workshop is a bit in this position mostly because we have an audience composed by HR researchers who I think the very minority is trained in design and has knowledge of design research. So they might, many people might start to apply like design methodologies, especially from human-centered design. But really building design knowledge is something a bit new for this field, to my understanding.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, but it's pretty clear from some of the previous presentations that the matters, what you're trying to create knowledge about is fundamental to who we are. There's some kind of fundamental questions of social companionship, you know, as an example, ecological perception. These are things that extend well beyond our field. And sometimes I think we get too parochial. And I think, you know, we have to think again, you know, what is of value here, and what do we want to know? And maybe it's easier. I lucked out, you know. Maybe I didn't know any better. I just did my research and things were okay. I kept my job and I got research funding. So, but I do think that's the way I thought it through. One thing I will say, so I think that there is a lot of methodological work, and you could take, so for example, constructive design research, the book by Ilpo and others, and they try to give a strategy of showroom, field, and lab. So whatever fits your, you know, whatever you're comfortable with, whatever your background is. Let me say one thing without trying to, I mean, I think that book it's a great opener, but there's a lot more work that needs to happen. I think they tend to break down when you try to actually apply them. So when you do this work, I think take a methodological starting point, but it is just a starting point. And I think there is always value. We still have this issue. When we read a paper, we always seem to have this secondary contribution of methodology. And it's because we're still trying to figure out how to do the work that we're doing. So I would never take this as a resting point. I think it's incumbent upon us and you guys to actually, push past, you know, strong concepts, push past intermediate level knowledge, push past prototypes and cultural and all of these things. Because I think that you know, that what we know, it's a, if you like, in philosophical terms, is an ontological, epistemological question. You know, what is it that we want to know, but how we know it is just as important.